My husband came home on a Tuesday evening with flowers I didn't ask for and a smile I didn't recognize. He set the bouquet on the counter, looked me straight in the eyes, and said the words he had clearly been rehearsing for days. "Rachel, I think I'm in love with someone else, and I think you deserve to know that." I turned off the stove, I wiped my hands on the dish towel, and then I picked up my phone and sent a single text to my attorney. "Start the process, tonight." But before we go any further, I want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And how old are you? I truly love knowing who's out there listening. Now let me tell you the whole story, because it starts a lot earlier than that Tuesday evening, and it ends somewhere Tyler never saw coming. My name is Rachel Monroe. I'm 41 years old, and for the past 11 years, I was the kind of wife who made everything look effortless, which was the biggest mistake I ever made. I met Tyler when I was 29. I was freelancing as a graphic designer, working out of a tiny apartment in Austin, Texas, pulling in decent money but nothing spectacular. He was charming in that easy, obvious way, the kind of man who walks into a room and immediately finds the center of it. He was starting what he called a creative consulting firm, which in reality meant he had a laptop, a logo he'd paid someone online to design, and an enormous amount of confidence that the details would sort themselves out. On our second date, he told me his vision. On our fifth, he asked for my opinion on his business plan. By the time he proposed, 14 months after we met, I had already spent more hours working on his brand than I had on any of my own clients. I told myself that's what partnership looked like. My mother told me it was a warning sign. I chose to believe myself. We got married in the spring. Small ceremony, backyard of my parents' house in San Antonio, my grandmother's pearl earrings and a dress I'd saved up for over 3 months. Tyler cried during his vows. He promised to build a life with me, not just beside me. I believed him completely. The first years were genuinely fine. I won't rewrite history to make the story cleaner. We worked hard. We laughed a lot. We built something together, or at least I thought we did. My freelance work started picking up. I had a talent for brand identity, the visual language companies use to tell the world who they are, and word spread quietly. Meanwhile, Tyler's consulting firm went through 3 pivots, 2 near collapses, and 1 full restart under a different name. Each time, he'd come to me with a new plan, a new energy, a new reason it would work this time. Each time, I believed him. Each time, I helped, financially, creatively, strategically. I designed every logo he ever presented to a client. I built the decks he pitched with. I wrote the website copy that won him his first retainer contract. He had the handshake and the confidence in the room. I was the engine running quietly behind the curtain. About 5 years into our marriage, something shifted in me, quietly, the way important things often do. I was working on a rebranding project for a small restaurant group, and the owner, a woman about 15 years older than me, looked at my portfolio and said, "Why are you still freelancing? You should have your own agency." I laughed it off, the way I always laughed off anything that suggested I might be worth more than I was charging for myself, but the thought stayed. I started building on the side, not dramatically, not with some grand declaration, just quietly, the way I'd learned to do most things. I registered a business under my maiden name, Monroe Creative Group. I took on 1 client, then 2, then 5. I reinvested every dollar back into the business, hired a part-time project manager, then a junior designer, then another. I set up the business account separate from our joint finances. Tyler knew I freelanced. He didn't ask questions about specifics because, honestly, the money side of our life had always bored him. I handled the accounts, the taxes, the insurance. He signed things I put in front of him and thanked me for keeping it all organized. When he asked how my work was going, I said fine. When he asked if I needed help, I said no. When he said I worked too much for the money I made, I said I was building something. He nodded the way people nod when they're not really listening. Here's what Tyler didn't know by year 8 of our marriage. Monroe Creative Group had 8 full-time employees, a client roster of 23 businesses across Texas and beyond, an annual revenue that had crossed a number Tyler would have found genuinely disorienting. Our biggest client was a mid-sized tech company that had trusted us with their complete rebrand, a 6-figure contract that took 2 years to land and another year to execute. We had a second office space, leased in my name through the business. I had built, slowly and without fanfare, the exact thing I had always been capable of building, while Tyler was on his fourth iteration of a consulting firm that still required my design work to look credible. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it because it matters to what comes next. Around year 9, I noticed the phone thing. Tyler had always been social, always texting, always on something. But there's a difference between the casual distraction of a person with an active social life and the particular alertness of someone who doesn't want you to see the screen. He started angling his phone away when I walked into a room. He started taking calls in the garage. He started going to the gym at unusual hours, which would have been unremarkable except that Tyler had not been to a gym voluntarily in the 4 years I'd known him to own a membership. I didn't confront him immediately. That felt reactive. Instead, I paid attention. I noticed the name that came up most often when his phone lit up face down on the table: Cassandra. I noticed the trips to Houston for client meetings that used to last a day and started lasting 3. I noticed the new cologne, the new shirts, the way he checked his reflection before leaving in the morning. He had started caring very much about how he looked to someone, and it was not to me. I hired a private investigator. I want to be clear that I did not do this impulsively or dramatically. I did it the same way I approached any professional problem, methodically, with the intention of having complete information before I made a single move. The investigator's name was Dennis, a retired detective out of Dallas, and he was thorough and professional and worth every dollar. Dennis confirmed what I already suspected within 2 weeks. Cassandra was 28 years old, an events coordinator Tyler had met at a networking mixer in Houston 8 months earlier. She was pretty in an obvious, effortful way. She was impressed by Tyler, who had described himself to her as the creative director of a boutique consulting firm with major clients across the South. She believed he was successful. She believed he was wealthy. She believed, based on what he'd told her, that he was only staying in his marriage out of obligation, that his wife was difficult, controlling, financially dependent, and that he was planning to leave as soon as the timing was right. This was, in case you're wondering, almost entirely the opposite of the truth. I read Dennis's reports the way I used to read complicated contracts, carefully, without flinching, making note of the details that mattered. I saved the photographs. I documented the timeline, and then I went back to my life and did not change a single visible thing. I kept cooking dinner. I kept asking about his day. I kept going to bed beside him and sleeping, or appearing to sleep, with the same measured breathing as always. What I was actually doing during the 6 weeks that followed was building a file with my attorney that was thorough enough to function as a small legal novel. My attorney's name is Patricia, and she's been my business attorney for 4 years. She is the kind of woman who speaks slowly and charges accordingly and is worth it every single time. When I laid out the situation, she reviewed the business registration, the asset history, the prenuptial agreement my father had quietly insisted upon before our wedding, and she looked at me over her glasses and said, "Tyler has no idea, does he?" It wasn't really a question. "No," I said. "He does not." We had signed a prenuptial agreement 11 years ago. Tyler had signed it the way he signed most things I put in front of him, with a glance, a nod, and a pen. My father, a retired accountant with a deep and abiding distrust of romantic optimism, had drafted the terms through his own attorney and presented them to us 3 weeks before the wedding. The agreement was straightforward. Anything I owned or built under my name or my business entities remained solely mine. Anything Tyler owned or built remained solely his. Marital assets were limited to what we specifically designated as joint. We had one joint account. We had the house, which was in both our names. We had Tyler's car, which was in both our names. Everything else, every client contract, every retainer, every piece of equity I had built in Monroe Creative Group was legally, unambiguously, entirely mine. Tyler had never thought to ask what he'd signed. He trusted me to handle things, and I had. So on a Tuesday in March, when my husband came home with flowers and the news that he was in love with someone else, I was not blindsided. I was not destroyed. I was ready. I listened to him talk. He sat across from me at the kitchen table and he explained, carefully and with what I think he believed was compassion, that his feelings for Cassandra were different from anything he'd felt before. He said she understood him in ways I hadn't in years. He said he still cared about me deeply and wanted us to handle this like adults. He said he thought we'd both be happier once we accepted what had clearly been true for a long time, that we wanted different things. He said a lot of things. I let him finish. Then I got up and I refilled my water glass and I stood at the counter for a moment, my back to him, and I sent the text to Patricia. When I turned around, my expression was calm. I said, "Okay, Tyler, I appreciate you telling me." He blinked. He had been braced, I think, for tears or anger or a plate thrown at his head. He got none of those things, and the absence visibly unnerved him. "I think we should talk about this," he said. "We will," I said. "Patricia will be in touch with your attorney. If you don't have one, you should get one." "Patricia?" He looked confused. "My attorney? Rachel, I'm not talking about a legal thing. I'm talking about our marriage." "I know," I said. "And I'm telling you that from this point forward, anything involving the end of our marriage goes through attorneys. That's not me being cold. That's me being smart." He left for a hotel that night. I slept better than I had in months. The next few weeks were illuminating in the particular way that clarity always is. Tyler had gone to stay with a friend and then, I was told by Dennis, had moved into Cassandra's apartment in Houston. He called me twice, both times with a tone that suggested he expected me to beg or bargain. I did not. I was polite, I was brief, and I referred him back to Patricia. Then the financial reality started to reach him. Tyler's consulting business had been running on a combination of his retainer clients, two of whom I had originally connected him with through my own network, and a business credit card attached to our joint account. When Patricia moved to separate our finances as the first step in the process, that card stopped working. Tyler called me from a gas station, genuinely confused, his voice halfway between offended and alarmed. "The card was declined," he said. "Yes," I said. "The joint account is being separated as part of the process. You'll receive documentation from Patricia." "Rachel, I have clients to take care of. I have operating expenses. You can't just shut off access." I explained, gently and clearly, that the card had been linked to a joint account, that we were both now entitled to split according to the prenuptial agreement. His half of the joint account balance would be transferred to an account in his name within 5 business days per the legal process. There was a long silence. "How much is in the joint account?" he asked. I told him. Another silence. Here is what Tyler had never asked in 11 years of me handling our finances. He earned a solid income when his consulting business was doing well, and I had always made sure the joint account looked comfortable because it was the account he looked at when he thought about our financial life. What he didn't know was that comfortable was approximately 1/8 of the full picture. The rest of the picture existed in accounts and entities and investments that bore my name alone. Over the following days, Tyler started making calls. He called our bank, asking questions. He called mutual friends, asking if they knew about my business. He started Googling, which I imagine was an interesting experience. Monroe Creative Group had been featured in 3 industry publications in the past 2 years. We had won a regional design award. Our website listed our client portfolio, our team, our capabilities. We were not a secret. We were simply something he had never thought to pay attention to. He called me on a Thursday, and his voice had changed entirely. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. It wasn't angry. It was something closer to dazed. "You never asked?" I said. That was true. In 11 years, Tyler had never once sat down and asked me to walk him through my business. He had accepted my version of it, which was modest, and he had never pushed further, because it never occurred to him that there was further to push. He saw a freelancer who kept the books and made dinner and helped him with his pitch decks. That was the image I had allowed, because fighting for a different one had never seemed worth the energy I had been building instead. I want to pause here and tell you something I think is important. I am not a perfect person, and I am not a perfect narrator of my own story. There were things I could have done differently. I could have insisted on more transparency earlier. I could have stopped carrying Tyler's business on the back of my reputation years before I did. I chose, for a long time, to let things be what they were because changing them felt harder than maintaining them. That was my mistake to own. But I did not make myself small on purpose. I made myself quiet because that felt safer, and I built in the quiet because building was what I knew how to do. Whatever Tyler chose to do with the space I gave him was his choice. He chose Cassandra. Fine, but he did not get to choose what was mine. Patricia and I had prepared thoroughly. The prenuptial agreement was airtight. The business documentation was complete. The asset records were clean and clear and entirely unambiguous about ownership. Tyler's attorney, whom he had hired somewhat frantically, reviewed everything and then had a very long, very quiet conversation with Tyler that I was not present for but can imagine fairly well. Tyler came to the meeting Patricia arranged with two things: his attorney and a posture that had lost most of its original confidence. We sat across a conference table from each other, the first time we'd been in the same room since he'd left. He looked tired. He looked like a man who had recently discovered that the floor he was standing on was not the floor he thought it was. Patricia walked him through the asset list: the house, which we would sell and split; the joint account, which we would split; Tyler's car, which he would keep; his consulting business, such as it was, which was his. And then she placed the summary of Monroe Creative Group in front of him with the business valuation attached and waited. He looked at the number for a long moment. "This is all hers," his attorney said quietly, already knowing the answer. "Entirely," Patricia confirmed, "per the prenuptial agreement signed and notarized 11 years ago." Tyler looked at me. I don't know exactly what he was looking for. Maybe he expected to find satisfaction on my face. He didn't. I was just watching him understand something he should have understood a long time ago. "I didn't know," he said, and I actually believed him. "I know you didn't," I said. "That's the point. There is a particular cruelty in being underestimated by someone who was supposed to know you best." Tyler had looked at me every single day for 11 years and seen, at most, half of what was actually there. Not because I hid it, because he never looked closely enough to find it. He was too busy being impressed by himself to be curious about me. He signed the divorce papers that afternoon. It was simpler than either of us expected, because when the actual facts of our financial situation were laid out clearly, there was nothing to fight over. He received exactly what was his. It was fair. It was not nothing, but it was not what he had been assuming he would walk away with when he sat down at my kitchen table with those flowers and his rehearsed speech about following his heart. I heard later, from a mutual friend, that Cassandra had been under the impression that Tyler was significantly wealthier than he turned out to be. I heard that the timeline between his moving into her apartment and his moving back out was approximately 6 weeks. I don't take pleasure in that. I genuinely don't. I hope they both land somewhere functional. I just wasn't willing to subsidize either of them getting there. The divorce was finalized on a Wednesday in October. Patricia sent me the confirmation and I read it at my desk, in my office, with a cup of coffee that I had made exactly the way I like it, which is strong and slightly too hot, a preference I had stopped bothering to explain to Tyler sometime around year 6. I felt something that I later decided was relief, not the loud, dramatic kind, just the quiet kind, the kind that settles in when something that has been pressing on you for a long time finally lifts. I want to tell you about the year after, because I think that's the part that actually matters. I threw myself into the business, but differently than before. Before, I had built Monroe Creative Group with one eye always on the door, half my attention always on whatever was happening at home. Now I was fully in it for the first time, and the difference was immediately visible. We landed our largest client to date, a regional healthcare network that needed a complete brand overhaul across 40 locations. I hired 2 more designers and a full-time operations manager, which freed me to do the work I actually love, the strategic side, sitting with a company and figuring out who they are and how to make the world see it. I also did something small that turned out to mean a great deal. I called my mother and told her she'd been right. She didn't say "I told you so." She just asked if I was okay and when I was coming home to visit. That conversation, ordinary as it was, reminded me that the people who actually see you don't need you to be impressive. They just need you to show up. I started taking weekends for myself. Not for catch-up work, not for strategic planning, just for whatever I felt like doing. I drove out to Fredericksburg and walked through the vineyards. I went to a jazz concert alone and sat in the dark and felt entirely peaceful. I rediscovered that I enjoy cooking when it's not an obligation, that I like going to bed early and reading until I fall asleep, that I had missed my own company without realizing it had gone somewhere. I took a trip to New York that I had been postponing for 3 years because Tyler didn't like New York. I walked 40 blocks through Manhattan on a crisp November day and stood in front of the Morgan Library and thought about all the things I'd set aside because they didn't fit into the shape of someone else's preferences. There were more things than I expected. Getting them back was gentler than I expected, too. About 8 months after the divorce, I started thinking about something that had been nagging at me since the whole process began. Not Tyler, not Cassandra, not any of it specifically. Something bigger. During the divorce proceedings, Patricia had mentioned, almost in passing, that she saw situations like mine more often than people would guess. Women who had built significant financial lives and kept them quiet, either out of habit or strategy, or simply because no one had ever asked. Women who had also signed things without reading. Women on the other side of that equation who had been completely financially dependent and had no idea how to begin. I thought about that for a long time. I had been lucky in specific and unusual ways. I'd had a father who understood paperwork. I'd had an instinct for financial autonomy that I'd followed without entirely knowing why. I'd been building my own income since before I was married, which meant leaving, when it came to that, was practically possible in a way it isn't for everyone. A lot of women don't have any of that. A lot of women quit jobs they loved. A lot of women have no credit history in their own name, no professional contacts outside the household, no version of themselves that exists independently in the financial world. A lot of women stay in situations they should leave because leaving is literally impossible without money and resources they don't have. I started talking to women's organizations in Austin about what that gap actually looked like. I did workshops through a local community center, practical ones. How to read a contract before you sign it, how to establish independent credit, how to structure a small business legally to protect what you build. I wasn't a social worker or a therapist. I was just someone who knew specific, useful things and could explain them clearly. The response was more than I expected. Women showed up in numbers the center hadn't anticipated. They brought questions that were urgent and real. They brought situations that were complicated and sometimes frightening. Some of them were at the beginning of something and wanted to build carefully. Some of them were at the end of something and needed to understand what came next. Every single one of them deserved someone in their corner with actual information. I won't pretend it was easy or that I got everything right. I won't tell you I became a different person who'd processed everything cleanly and moved forward without looking back. I had hard nights. I had moments of missing the uncomplicated early version of my marriage when Tyler was charming and I was in love with the idea of building something together before I understood that I was the one doing most of the building. Grief is not a straight line. Missing something and knowing it needed to end are not contradictory. But here's what I can tell you truthfully, from the other side of all of it. I know who I am now in a way I didn't entirely before. Not because Tyler was wrong to leave, though the way he handled it was cowardly and unkind. Not because I proved something to anyone, because I didn't need to prove anything. I know who I am because I finally stopped organizing my life around what someone else needed from it and started asking what I needed from it instead. That question, as basic as it sounds, was one I had avoided for a long time. The answer keeps surprising me in good ways. Monroe Creative Group is doing better than it ever has. I have a team I'm proud of, clients I genuinely enjoy, work that challenges me in the right directions. I have a small house now, just mine, in a neighborhood where I can walk to a coffee shop and know the owner's name. I have a standing Sunday call with my mother and a group of women friends I actually see regularly, not just intend to see. Last spring, I went to a conference for women business owners in Dallas. At dinner, I sat next to a woman named Diane, 56, who had spent 20 years running the operations side of her husband's manufacturing company and had her name on nothing. He was retiring and moving the business to their son, and she was standing at 60 looking at a future she hadn't built any architecture for. We talked for 3 hours. I gave her Patricia's number. I told her what I knew. She emailed me a month later to say she'd started the process of establishing her own consulting practice and that it was terrifying and that she was glad. I kept that email. I don't know what the rest of my story looks like. I know that I'm not in a hurry to find out. I know that I'm doing the work that actually matters to me, that I'm showing up for the people in my life with my full attention, that I'm sleeping well and eating properly and getting outside enough, which sounds like a small list, but is actually everything. I know that when my phone rings now, I pick it up with my own name in my head, not someone's wife, not the quiet one, not the person handling the background details while someone else takes up the center of the room. Rachel Monroe, 41 years old, business owner, someone who finally figured out that being underestimated is only fatal if you believe it too. And if you are somewhere out there listening to this, and some part of what I said sounds familiar, if you've been building quietly while someone else was taking the credit, if you've been signing things without reading them or arranging your life around someone else's preferences until you can barely remember what yours were, I want to say this as plainly as I can. You don't have to wait for a Tuesday evening and a bouquet of flowers you didn't ask for. You don't have to be blindsided and broken open before you decide to start building something that belongs entirely to you. Start building now. Start small if you have to. Put your name on things. Ask the questions that feel too basic to ask. Read what you sign. Find a Patricia. Call your mother back. The best moment to start was 10 years ago. The second best moment is right now. I'm glad you stayed until the end. If this story meant something to you, please let me know you were here. Like the video, leave a comment with where you're watching from and how old you are. I love hearing from every single one of you, from whatever corner of this world you're sitting in. I'll see you in the next one.